oh man, here we're coming. We're going outside the house to look at, what is it? The tap.
This is We Bleed Orange and Black, the podcast for Halloween and horror lovers. Join us as we interview creators, discuss our favorite horrors, and share original spooky stories. I'm Jeff C. Carter, and this week we're talking with Andrew F. Sullivan and Nick Cutter about their new book, The Handyman Method. Returning champion Andrew Brutal as Fuck Sullivan is the author of 2023's ubiquitous eco-horror novel, The Marigold. His fiction and criticism have appeared in The National Post, The Globe and Mail, Beneath Ceaseless Skies, and other publications. His collection, All We Want Is Everything, and his debut novel, Waste, were both named Best Books of the Year by the Globe and Mail. He lives in Hamilton, Ontario. Welcome to the show, Andrew.
Thanks for having me.
Craig Davidson, aka Nick Cutter, is the author of the acclaimed bestsellers The Deep and Little Heaven, as well as The Troop, which is currently in development with James Wan. His literary fiction includes Rust and Bone, The Saturday Night Ghost Club, and his recent collection, Cascade. He retired from Fighting Writers in 2007 with a perfect record. Welcome to the show, Craig.
A perfect losing record. Yes, thank you very much, Jeff. Thanks for having me.
A perfect record is nothing to sneeze at.
Yeah, exactly.
Here's an icebreaker for you guys. What was the weirdest YouTube or Wikipedia rabbit hole you've ever gone down?
I'm trying to think of something that I remember too, because I think sometimes with these things, you almost go into like a fugue state. But there's a Wikipedia page of inventors killed by their own inventions.
Are you always trying to get your own name on that list?
Yeah. Just see where I can end up. What do I have to do? It's not an insanely long list, but it quickly spirals out as you start, clicking those little blue words. That right click, open link in new tab can really just ruin your life. Definitely something I've returned to here and there. It's definitely sort of the trunk of the tree, and then you end up climbing up into the branches.
Or digging down to the roots, as the case may be.
Or digging down to the roots, one or the other, yeah. I think the roots might be something worse, yeah.
Honestly, I do have a really sort of, and I mean sincerely macabre one that would really probably bring the whole tone of the whole podcast down immediately. I mean that sincerely. Would you like to hear it, Jeff? I mean, it's your podcast, so.
Yeah, this isn't live, so if it really ruins my day, I'll just cut it out.
Good, because it might, because it's not funny either. It's just kind of like, it really does show how the rabbit hole worked back in the day, or the wormhole. This was like back in 2012, and I was doing some research for something. It was Mexican Coke. I wanted to know how it was made, and so I typed that in, and then whatever the scroll was back then for YouTube became like, are you interested in Mexican drug lords? Are you interested in the Zetas? Are you interested in all the stuff that's going on in Mexico? And then I think it wasn't even the algorithm; it was my own macabre interest that brought me to one. And I swear to God, it wouldn't be on YouTube anymore, but it was a drug, cheat or thief or someone who kept money from the Zetas laid out on an old door. I swear to Christ, getting his head sawed off with a machete. So that was the rabbit hole that I went down, and that type of content is no longer available on YouTube. It probably shouldn't be available anywhere except in FBI files or things like that, but I remember seeing it and thinking, I think I was still somewhat new to YouTube too, and I was like, "Oh my God, I cannot sincerely believe this is available." And then I'm watching it, but it exerted an enormously deleterious and macabre effect on me, and so yeah. Sorry, Jeff. Sorry to start things off that way, but you asked for icebreakers, so.
The sad fact is that all of that stuff is available on YouTube and TikTok and 1,000 other portals, but there is an army of undertrained, underpaid people that are just thrown at it to soak it all up, soak up all the horror for us. And it's just this monstrous cost of online video. We need all these human sacrifices who have no particular education or training. The only thing that capitalism can consume is their basic humanity. If it's something that they would react to with horror, they delete the footage.
Yeah.
Every day there's a war going on, and there are like these Russian conscripts being force fed into the fire to keep us scrolling happily. And that fucks me up all the time thinking about it. So thanks, Craig. Thanks for bringing me there.
I was sitting there as Andrew was talking, going, why say it, Craig? Just say something about, my son or daughter watching YouTube, and they go from, Thomas the Train to like a slightly less good Thomas the Train. That would have been okay, but sorry. Anyways, I didn't mean to crack that open.
No, I think that it doesn't bring the show down. It roots us to where we need to be, I think, to have a proper discussion about your new book, The Handyman Method. But before we do that, can I get just a brief thumbnail? Tell us a bit about yourself. Do you remember the first thing you ever made? A short story, a poem, a short film, anything like that?
The first thing that I ever made, boy, probably the first thing I did was film stuff. I got into my father rented a VHS recorder at the video store along with a copy of Clash of the Titans. Me and my buddy would do obviously Andrew is younger than me, but I'm not sure about you, Jeff. Anyway, it was Mr. Bill, which was an SNL kind of plasticine figure who always got himself into calamities. So we did a lot of stop motion Mr. Bill stuff. And that would probably be the first thing that I was, again, it wasn't even my own stuff. It was seeing something that I liked and admired and I thought was funny and just trying to do my own version of it. So that would have been back when I was around 8 or 9.
My friends and I had a big mass of silly putty. And so we would set up our VHS camcorder and we would try to do our stop animation with silly putty, but you had to work fast because it was constantly melting. And the more you used it, the sloppier it got. And so it was these slowly melting figures shambling and shuddering across the screen in jittery motion. Good times.
I like that. Yeah.
Yeah, it was pretty cool. What got you into horror, Craig?
Stephen King. I was a kid of the 80s, and you couldn't walk down the street in the 80s without a Stephen King book hitting in the back of the head. As Andrew likes to say, I'm a voracious reader of all across the spectrum, especially of that generation, the generation I came up in. But I went to school and I did some higher education, and you were not expected to write horror. In fact, you weren't even probably allowed to at the time. Hopefully that's changed. Yeah, I had this idea for a horror book way back in 2012 or something, and I wrote it. It's allowed me to have this sort of second, I wouldn't even say it's a shadow career anymore. It's probably the more well-known part of my career. But I'm grateful for it because, again, it was my first love.
Awesome. Without further ado, let's get into the Handyman Method. You note that this story began as a short story. What was the initial inspiration?
Yeah, I think basically Craig had been like, hey, do you want to write something? I think it would be fun/funny and we can see what happens. And then I came to him with an idea where I was like, we both had this experience, but fixing stuff around the house, the best thing to do is YouTube. But it so easily becomes not what you expected. And you're seeing into people's lives. There is often with the smaller channels, not a lot of editing. You see a lot of things you wouldn't see. You also see the weird uniformity of the American house and, all the walls to the same, building code is good in a lot of ways, but it also has created this really weird, cheap, uniform, collapsible lifestyle. And well, what if there was a guy who just kept pushing your limit a little bit on the other side of the screen? That sort of parasocial relationship. And what if, he just kept pushing this guy to go further and further? So 7 videos in, he's like, no, dig out the foundation. You can do it by yourself. Just making terrible suggestions. But this, sort of one-sided relationship, the person gets very invested. I think you actually do see that happen with a lot of podcasts and streamers and Twitch people and so on and so forth. But I wanted to keep it kind of grubby and half attempted. And so that's kind of where the origin of the book came from. I think we were calling this story Repairs at that point, and it was just a man being taunted by a YouTube channel that never thought he was good enough. And that was fun, but I think very quickly we wanted to expand from there. The seed was there, but I think it did need more flesh on the bones. And that's kind of where we ended up going. But that original seed was, how long does it take you to be convinced by a screen that you need to do what it says?
Did the way you guys collaborated on the short story continue as the project expanded into a novel, or did you have to change your process?
I think it stayed more or less similar. We expanded so much from what our initial expectation of our collaboration was going to be. But I mean, we wouldn't have worked with one another had we not like respected each other's aesthetic, tone, abilities, dedication, just sort of like get down and do it sort of a thing. I think Andrew would agree. It was really rather seamless. And some people have read the book. They're sort of like, I can't see where Nick starts and Andrew begins. We've talked about this before, Andrew. We haven't really done a lot of it. I've done some screenplay writing with other people, but I've never co-wrote, well, even so much as a story. So doing a novel was a great departure, but I mean, it ended up being like a really fun collaboration.
I was telling Andrew before we started rolling that it was hard to read the story quickly because every sentence was like a diamond mine. I was marveling over the word choices, honestly. I was wondering if you guys each tackled each sentence.
I don't think on that sort of a granular level, we dipped into each other's pocket.
We both read every line. And so we both were like, is this working? You made line edits on my stuff. Generally, I was like, yeah. Even though a line edit, maybe you're cutting back, it was generative where the other person was like, unless there was a big problem, we were kind of like, yeah, those edits make sense. So you did almost have this other editor. My wife is reading it right now for the first time. She's a bit scared of it. She reads like a chapter and like puts it down, waits a day and then reads another chapter. And she is like, I don't know who wrote what part, which is crazy because she's read all of my books. Like Marigold, I think she read 5 times, like through the process, and is a novelist herself. So that's kind of crazy. You also wanted to keep the ball in the air too. You weren't going to drive this story into a corner.
I think ball in the air is a really good turn of phrase. And it also seemed like you were both heightening it from the first page when, I mean, I want to talk about the process in general, but I'm just going to dip into the book for this one reference. In one of the very first paragraphs, the husband notices that they are so isolated that he could fire a shotgun and nobody would hear them. And I was like, God damn, that sentence is doing some double duty. What kind of research did you guys do in terms of home repair, YouTube? Did you guys have to check out any dark corners?
I feel like most of the research was sort of just came from our background and our history as actually having lived in houses, and neither of us being particularly skilled at carpentry or the arts of handyman. And that feeling, that sort of strange emasculating feeling that sometimes you have when you're tasked with trying to fix something, like my wife calls them Craig fixes, which are fixes that sort of work, but they aesthetically look really unpleasant. Good enough fixes are kind of my forte, and then eventually there's enough good enough fixes around the house that we actually call a handyman and say, do you actually fix all the good enough fixes and make them proper fixes? I used to weirdly, when I was a kid, would watch This Old Home, like Bob Villa's, and I found it very soothing, and I found it very like he'd go talk to the carpenter. The carpenter would just be making these things that look like little gems. And I thought that kind of ability, it was really pleasing on all sorts of levels. And so, I mean, I think that sort of fed into a little bit of the portrayal of handyman, of Hank.
Yeah, even before I had a house, like this idea was coming just because like a fuse blows in the apartment. And I'm like, okay, I can deal with my landlord who is absent, or I can figure this out. And I do think like YouTube has become a way, in a good way, where you can learn how to do things that are just one quick trick. Now, we've seen Google get progressively worse over the past decade. It used to be you could get exactly what you wanted. Now you basically have to type in what you want and then put Reddit on the end and then click that, and then you'll get an actual answer. So I was also kind of feeling that, like you try to look something up and you're digging through so much shit and so many people trying to sell you something. But the euphoria of finding a guy who doesn't want to sell you anything, who doesn't have a 10-minute video being like, oh man, here we're coming. We're going outside the house to look at, what is it? The tap. Like instead just being like, so the tap outside your house is leaking. Here's how you fix it. Do, boom. And it's a 30-second video and you got to watch it 20 times because you're like, oh, okay. But it's exactly what you're looking for in a small bite. And that was becoming harder and harder for me to find to just do a basic thing in my apartment. And so the idea of like stumbling upon what you think is a guy just trying to help you out, that felt very real. Craig likes to joke that I look like I could fix something, but I can't, which is true. So, just how you're perceived, like when I do have guys coming to work at my place now, like often, yeah, they just assume I know what they're talking about because I'm standing out there with a bunch of tattoos or whatever else. So they're like, oh, yeah, you know how it is, brother. We got to get in there at the depot in the morning and then we'll be out here around 7. And then, we got to take off around 12 because my mom, she's got diabetes and I got to move the microwave. There is this sort of assumed familiarity that I don't have, but I'll fake it as long as I can. So I think with horror, often you are tapping into like your own, what actually scares you or what bothers you or what can really break you down. Also something that did feel contemporary. This is happening now. This is, to me, a new way of your life being infiltrated. You building relationships with people that aren't there, talking to a screen or letting a screen talk to you. I think it is very haunted in its way. I think it is a very fancy Ouija board.
Speaking of haunted, Craig, you have mentioned elsewhere the pressure to write something that is ostensibly in the haunted house genre and the weight of all those paperbacks that you read in the 80s. What do you think is the state of the haunted house in 2023?
Oh, man. What a...
You gotcha.
Yeah, Jeff. Listen, I can obviously offers my dime store opinion on that. Obviously, The Shining, The Haunting of Hill House. I guess the Amityville Horror to an extent. I think I wasn't thinking about that, but sometimes you have to recognize that it's filtering through a big brain pan, and what comes out may in fact have influences that they weren't your on the ground influences. I even liked Hell House by Richard Matheson, which to me felt like he'd read The Haunting of Hill House and said, I really like this. Let's just do it with like horny ghosts instead. So what was the other one? Alice Sebold. Which one was it, Andrew? We both liked.
Oh, we were talking about like for our old influences. Yeah, we were talking about The House Next Door,
Right.
And River Siddons, like sort of the classic new house that is vindictive and haunted. In what I do still think that book's probably 40 years old now, 50 years old, and yet still seems very relevant. The old haunted house or the ghost story is a very sort of British tradition. And then America kind of accelerated it because it speaks to, I think, kind of sometimes being in a place you're not supposed to. I think that's sort of what the haunted house evolved into in America a bit. And you see that in like newer books like Johnny Compton's The Spite House is probably the most contemporary and interesting one to me. Johnny was on a couple panels with me recently and one with Craig, and his knowledge of it and his sort of take on it, I think was really special, and somebody who really understands the genre and has really dug deep into it. And so The Spite House itself, I think, is a really compelling book because it's a modern haunting that's still informed by a historical background, but also embracing, something that the author just enjoyed, where it was like, oh yeah, the concept of a spite house, like, let's run with that. And anytime I see a writer sort of seize something and run with it, that gets me excited. So I think that for me with the modern haunted house is the idea of applying our current anxieties to the home. And I think maybe that's also why like the Anne River Siddons is still relevant, because that anxiety is still there, that you're going to purchase something, put your whole life into it, and it might just spite you because it can. We used to have that more with cars. You look to Christine and you look to with a lemon or I think the car really used to be more of a haunted vessel. Maybe we bring that back. I mean, Elon's definitely trying to kill as many people as possible, but
do you think that the auto horror subgenre was related to the decline of the North American auto industry, and with lemons and Pintos exploding and things like that? And now we are post subprime mortgage lending meltdown, and so many people were underwater or lost their homes or got evicted without cause or without a paperwork trail. And now you've got these housing bubbles, these boom and bust cycles. So many people are locked out of the housing market.
Yeah.
So it is their dream and their nightmare to get a house. It can make generational wealth or it can ruin you.
Yeah.
It seems like there's a lot of festering anxiety there for you to capitalize on, like the Marigold sort of hit the sweet spot with this urban decay eco horror. And then you add in all the tech stuff on top of that and all the toxic masculinity. It's a pretty peak and gumbo you guys are working with.
Thanks, man. Yeah, I think you're right. Like, I do think the anxieties of a time come through in horror or are processed that way. There is also, yeah, you're right. There's that other nightmare of beyond being locked out of the housing market too, it's getting in and then being trapped and being hooked and having something own you in a way that you didn't realize at first. Like, I think like people getting under interest rates, all those things, like 2008 is still very fresh in my mind, even though I was pretty young at the time and wasn't even thinking of a house. But watching that sort of like cascade through America, I think it really did inform a lot of my view of housing and the world. And with a book like this, we just wanted to simplify it down to what if you're so desperate that you take the first thing that comes your way, because that's all you can get. And what happens when it doesn't turn out the way you wanted? Like, you think you found your haven, but like a home isn't like gonna save you, right? It's like anything else. Like publishing a book isn't gonna save you. Like accomplishing some goal, you're still alive after. You still got to deal with the next thing. The house as a goal, I think that was something we kind of wanted to undermine a bit, just because entropy is real, like decay is real, stuff falls apart. You eventually have a dryer that doesn't work, and you're like, how did I get it down here in the first place? I didn't. I don't know how to get it out. I've now got this benign tumor in my basement.
Speaking of entropy, Craig, you've written articles about the male enhancement industry and cycling steroids.
Deep dive.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, Jeff does deep dives, man. I tried to warn you. I said he was good.
No, but sure, let's talk.
Yeah.
Would you call yourself an observer of masculinity?
Oh, I wish I could say it was so clinical and so detached. It's not. I'm existing with all those trappings and trying to find my own way through. I do definitely find as I get older that those things mean less to me, those specific sort of markers that when I was younger. And even writing, and I think Andrew too, I think our early books, our collections, were focused very strongly on how do I, as a man, of a certain age, find my way through the world. Because, you're really essentially in some ways writing from your own, perspective and your own back door and trying to sort of sort your way through these things. And they're the things that felt at that point in my life the most meaningful to me, and they felt they're the things that like galvanized me towards writing the most. But as I've gotten older and I worked my way towards my 50s, perhaps unsurprisingly, whatever the tokens of masculinity that felt really meaningful to me in my 20s and 30s don't feel quite so important to me anymore. But at the same point, it seems to be Andrew and I both with this book, if you're a writer, it's the greatest way to discover your obsessions. And you're like a bee that just keeps going back to the same flower every time it pollinates, and you think you're maybe getting something a little different, and I think you do. Age will give you a different sort of texture to that pollen each time you go back to the bloom, but in a certain way it still has the same sort of fundamental texture of that obsession. So in that way, it's sort of fun to work through those obsessions. And the best writing I generally do is the stuff that's the most dipping closest to my own lived experience and the things that go through my brain. Sometimes even the icky, embarrassing ones, I sort of mind that. And sadly, for Andrew's sake, I can't be like, oh yeah, in this book, all these things, these are my weird phobias that are coming up. They have nothing to do with Andrew. That's just one of the sort of shortcomings or whatever, one of the risks of co-writing with a lunatic like me.
Your protagonist, Trent, is in crisis when the book opens. Much of this crisis is related to his own self-image of his masculinity. Do you feel like some of these things are rooted in an older generation? Or do you feel like some of these things are piping hot from the TikTok era?
I mean, they're definitely relevant now. I mean, you look at just the level of Andrew Tate kind of bullshit out there. A lot of that shit is smoke and mirrors and deeply pathetic in a way. And I think sometimes what happens is you have kids almost like speed run that part of it, realize that the cars are fake or the lifestyle's fake or the plane is rented. But instead of realizing, oh, maybe this was a scam or a game taking advantage of my insecurity, or they retreat in another direction where it was like, oh, actually, no, like the past was better, or there's a secret older, I'm going to go back to the earth and learn how to do all these things and be a man. And that way, the fucking poison of nostalgia, it is a disease. And so they think they're going back in time to like reclaim something that was never really what it was. Handyman is sort of about the fake out of trying to go back.
You mentioned Tate, and I feel like there's that personality. You can find one or more of them in every generation going back. I mean, Trump is a manifestation of that. There was that in the 1920s. There was that book called like Think and Grow Rich, and it was the same. It was peddling essentially snake oil, but there's always men lining up to buy that. And, Iron John in the 60s or whatever. Like, this doesn't go away. It's just knitted tight to our genome. It just seems like we can't evolve past it, but each generation has its own kind of particular refraction of how it affects us. In the book, I found that the main thing that I was focusing on is that men of our generation, my generation, I have a difficult time relating to our wives or our partners in terms of their success, because that wasn't necessarily how we saw it enacted in our own childhoods. It's like the women of those generations were sometimes, their success was sort of thwarted by proxy, just because it was like, well, it's dad's career. I feel like that's a lot of in the book, and the Rita character is, I think we tried to present her as struggling in a way with her own burdens, of expectations that are associated with her, not to give too much away, but again, her role and what that means, and the idea of breaking away from that kind of legacy, which I think it's not gendered. I think it is gendered, in that both sides of the gender divide have their own things that they struggle against in terms of success, having children, getting married, all sorts of things that I think cause us to question ourselves.
Andrew, you had mentioned that this is a sort of two-ended problem. You have this older generation that is raging against the dying of the light or is fragile, lashing out at change. And then you have this newer generation of men that are insecure and perhaps feel groundless, looking for some guidance and finding it from toxic sources. I saw something a while ago where someone was analyzing the fashion of young conservatives, and what they realized was that they were dressing and stylizing themselves after older conservatives. Older conservatives are trying to appear somewhat young and relevant, and so they're combing over their hair. These young men are combing their hair in the same way to look like old guys trying to look like young guys. They're wearing izods. They're marching through the streets with their tiki torches. And it really is a snake eating its own ass. It's this horrible death spiral of angry old white men and lost, embittered young men. And because you have Trent, who is being seduced by this older handyman do-it-yourselfer, you actually get the whole thing.
Yeah, I think we were trying to play with that. Where Craig and I really overlap very intensely is in that dread moment. I think that's where our horror collides, manifesting that dread and then keeping it at a hard boil for a long time. I've definitely felt that even rereading parts of Handyman, where I'm like, oh, wow, we're just doing this. Okay.
What did you guys come up with in terms of a game plan for when it would get supernatural, how they would manifest, what the impact would be on the story, and how far would it go each time?
We went over so many iterations that the story had a certain inflection points, and then the novella had its own inflection points, and the finished novel had its own too. But I think one of you said something like keeping it at a high boil, and that's sort of what's our, I think, thought pattern for the book, is sort of keeping it moving forward. And I'm trying to think in the book when the first real sign of something amiss happens, but it's fairly quick, actually. It might even be Rita's reaction to entering the house. That's not really a supernatural. That's a harbinger of things to come. So, I said this, I think, at another point. I grew up reading King and Barker and Kamen, and they just like back in the 80s, 90s, there were big books. 1,000 pages, 800 pages. That was not uncommon. Those length of books, I think Chuck Wendig's done a couple lately, but I don't think in general in the horror sphere there are people who are writing books of that kind of, maybe The Passage by Justin Cronin and that sort of trilogy also, but they're vanishingly rare compared to how they used to be. And all I can feel anecdotally is that readers sort of want, I wouldn't say they want, but like a momentum is kind of, and that's probably part to do with YouTube and the idea of like a listicle instead of a magazine article. You know, when I first started writing, you mentioned my magazine work. I mean, I did long form journalism. I'm one of the dinosaurs who actually would get offered to write a 5,000 word, 6,000, 8,000 word piece, which, I mean, again, those things just don't happen as much anymore. I feel like I was on the bleeding edge of that. So I'm trying to think when the first supernatural thing happened within the book, but I'm guessing it happens fairly swiftly.
It happens early and often. I was expecting more of a slow burn through the course of a 300-page book. Now I wonder if starting with a 5,000-word story and then expanding it into a longer short story and a longer short story and then a novella and then a novel allowed you to keep all those previous iterations of early impacts and keep ratcheting up the tension to a rolling boil, as you've been saying. I would reference Pennywise in the way that certain fears are manifested around the house, and every character gets their own custom version of some kind of horror. But what I thought was so brilliant was that, unlike in Stephen King's It, where someone sees something and then goes running to their friends and was like, oh my God, I had this encounter. And they each one by one have their encounters and they get together in their little club and they huddle up and like, what does this mean? What happened to you? Because these are things that are preying on their mind, you can have your cake and eat it too. It's preying on their mind to make them see something or make them do something, and it can just as easily make the characters disassociate and just forget what they had. So what you're really doing is you're torturing the audience and you're letting the characters off the hook, because the characters can get traumatized over and over and over again and not remember it. And at about the time when we're screaming, get out of the house, they're like, oh, that's odd. You know, there's bugs in the light bulb. You're like, no, run. Devious.
Well, I think we wanted Handyman Hank sort of be sort of a narcotic too. A narcotic and also a honeypot, whatever. So you basically once he ensnares you, which is, I think, sort of haunted houses, sort of an inborn trait of haunted house narratives as well, is that most haunted house narratives would be over within 10 pages. Oh, this place is fucked up. Bye. And then the moving van and they leave. So one of the sort of tricks is the wrong word, but one of the challenges is to try to keep the characters there, but within that, try to actually make it reasonable that they're not complete frontal lobotomy. So yeah, you're right. There is that sort of, that was part of the gamesmanship there is that disassociating and having trends, especially because Rita has her own reasons for staying there.
I just think also I think for me, it was just like, okay, we're doing like this haunted house YouTube channel thing, whatever else. You have the premise right there. If we don't at least start cooking, let's play with the toys. Let's get into it. We're going to use it. Let's just use it from day one. We may as well. We're not trying to like lure you into wanting to live in this house, you know? The first chapter makes it clear like there's problems here, you know, and there's compromises. This is not the dream. This is like the dream that is already being corrupted.
Handyman Hank has a little helper named Little Boy Blue who comes through the ever-present iPad into the life of their son Milo. There's a scene where Milo is following Little Boy Blue's instructions on how to help his pet turtle. You guys crystallized a horror for me that I don't know if I ever would have examined. Little Boy Blue is dancing around singing, "You can fix anything." A horrible shudder went through me because there are things in life that are wrong and broken, and you must face them with humility and acceptance. But if you live in denial, you're just going to accelerate down the wrong path. It's so hideous because it's like plastic surgery that goes too far, and you just want to grab these people and shake them and scream, stop. And they can't stop. And it's self-inflicted. if you've ever known a couple who have a failing relationship and like, we're going to have a baby, that's going to save it. And you're like, no, stop. You can fix anything is uniquely monstrous. And I'm very upset with both of you for weaponizing it so effectively.
Well, I have been writing that in the books, Jeff, as my sign off. So that's I'm glad that tapped into there. I do think there's a unique horror to that. That sort of theme actually comes up in RoboCop as well. Just a shout out to Verhoeven.
Shout out to
Big
Detroit.
influence on me. Yeah, shout out to Detroit, one of my favorite cities. Yeah. It's related to haunting in a way too, because it's kind of like we can make things as they were, like we can fix it, and it's like eventually you can't, right? Like eventually you have to gut it or you got to tear it down
or God forbid accept entropy.
Yeah.
But the algorithm does not want us to accept entropy. The algorithm is obsessed with keeping us in the fantasy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, and exactly too. You said like failed marriages, or and we all know people like that, and they're otherwise like well-adjusted, successful, but they just I think all of us have at least one blind spot.
We had a boy who was living with us for a while. While he was here, he became obsessed with YouTube videos about Roblox. Craig, I don't know if your kids.
My son too. Yeah. Roblox, my son.
These were specifically Roblox recreations of Squid Game.
Oh, yeah, I think Nick.
Hours and hours and hours of staring at the TV while these little blocky characters recreated the events of Squid Games, the global Netflix sensation. And it really felt like the algorithm was in our living room.
Well, it's that's exactly right, and my son too. It's like you hear stuff on I remember one. It was Siren Head. Do you guys remember that?
Yep.
It was like, and then it goes or Pennywise. It goes around the schoolyard like a virus, and then everyone comes home and asks their parents, like, "Do you know who Siren Head is? Do you know who Pennywise is?" And we just play dumb generally. And Squid Game was one of those too, because obviously it was a huge sensation, and kids shouldn't have been watching it, but some kids do, or even if you don't, even the name itself is this kind of and then you think, well, okay, you can watch it on Roblox because you're not really watching it, but it's essentially the same. It's the same plot. I let my kid watch, just so you know. Yeah, it's not like I'm not trying to put out a moral sort of crucible.
Yeah, part of what we worked into this book was that these things do have a life of their own that's not ours, and that's what's kind of terrifying about it. It is inhuman. That's the best way to put it, I think.
Yeah, and you've noticed as much as it reaches out to us as adults, the person it really goes for first is the kid.
Yeah, and I do think that's why, too, like the Milo stuff for me is really super key to the book. I don't think it really works without having like, oh no, there's a different version of this. There's a different generation of this. Like, yes, masculinity, else, but like people are looking for that sort of comfort or direction.
The last time we spoke, you were telling me about the Handyman. What do you guys have up next?
I've got a couple Cutter books in the pipeline. Andrew, I don't know. What are you up to? I mean, you've always got irons in the fire.
I need to disappear for 3 months and just bang something out. It's been a crazy year to have 2 books after not having books for a long time. It feels good to kind of have the work out there and people responding to the work.
Where can our listeners find you online?
You can find me on most of the apps at AF Sully, AFSULLI. If you just Google Andrew F. Sullivan, you can usually find my website and everything I'm up to. I keep it pretty updated.
And Craig, you're not online. You're just in Toronto?
I'm just in Toronto. I'm just, roaming the streets.
Yeah.
If we can.
Out there in these streets. I guess people can find you on bookshelves everywhere behind the covers of the Handyman Method.
Yeah, thank you.
That's right.
Thanks for hanging out, guys. This was awesome.
Thanks for having us, Jeff.
Thank you.
Please subscribe and follow. Links are in the show notes. You can find me at jeffccarter.com and hit the link to pick up my collection, We Bleed Orange and Black, 31 fun-sized tales for Halloween. Until next time, stay spooktacular.
So the tap outside your house is leaking. Here's how you fix it. Do 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 boom.